Today I'm going to tell you another strange story. It will be about events that can be said to have been fateful for the entire modern history of mankind. To be more precise, the whole modern history began after the strange events of 1812. In different countries, the events of 1812th year are called differently. In America, this is the Anglo-American War. In Russia, the Patriotic War of 1812. In Germany, these events are called the Battle of the Nations. And even a very remarkable monument was erected in honor of this battle, more like a base of aliens from the alien universe. So, at the beginning of the 19th century, a very global event took place, in honor of which strange monuments were built all over the world. And here's what else is very important. Monuments dedicated to the events of 1812th year were not erected immediately after the hostilities, which would be very logical. For example, take the Second World War. After the surrender of Germany, monuments were erected throughout Europe to remind of this war. Small and sculptural compositions were installed a few years after the war. Large-scale memorial complexes were erected decades later. In other words, the World War passed, and people did not wait 50 or 100 years to erect a monument in memory of these events. Monuments were erected almost immediately after the Second World War. For example, in 1946 year, the Soviet military administration decided to re-equip Soviet military graves in Berlin. And already in May 1949th year, the most famous Soviet military memorial outside the Soviet Union was inaugurated in Treptow. That is, Germany capitulated in the 45th. The memorial was opened in the 49th, that is, in 4 years. And this, of course, is a logical course of events. But we can observe a completely illogical course of events after the end of another more global war of 1812. All specially trained people recognize that the events of 1812 were fateful for the countries that participated in them. In Germany, these events were called the Battle of the Nations. In Russia, the Patriotic War. In other words, everyone recognizes the huge scale of events, and it would be logical to assume that monuments to these events will begin to be avoided immediately after the war, as it was after the Second World War. In short, monuments in memory of the War of 1812 began to be massively built only 50 years after the end of the war. And the heyday of construction fell on 13th years. It was then that the most iconic monuments dedicated to the War of 1812 were erected. That is, in a world where there was not only a telephone and a telegraph, in a world where 80% of the population could not count, not write. Monuments dedicated to global wars were erected 50 and more often 100 years after the end of the war. Don't you think that's a bit counterintuitive? In a world where there is no TV, a majestic monument is the most effective way to convey information about any historical event. So, in the 19th century, for some reason, they did not consider it necessary to erect monuments dedicated to the War of 1812. For some reason, these monuments began to be massively built only in 1912. In other words, the war ended, someone won it, and for 100 years, no one built memorial complexes in honor of this event. And here too, one important nuance must be taken into account. Today, it is very difficult to determine the original purpose of structures built before the 20th century. Because the history of these structures, to put it mildly, looks very doubtful. Take, for example, 2 structures built in the 19th century and allegedly related to the War of 1812. The first construction is the Triumphal Arch in Moscow. It was built according to the project of the architect Bove in honor of the victory of the Russian people in the Patriotic War of 1812. Everything seems to be in order. This monument was erected 22 years after the war. The monument is large, so it was built for a long time, and even the inscription on this monument is appropriate. This is the Triumphal Gate, laid down as a sign of remembrance of the triumph of Russian soldiers in 1814th year. In other words, there is a monument in the center of Moscow dedicated to the events of 1812th year, which is confirmed by this tablet here. It seems that everything is accurate. There is a monument, there is an inscription, that tells in honor of which this monument was built. That's how it is. But if we look at the photo of 1883rd year, we will see that it is signed as the Triumphal Gate, which, by the way, is true. The same gates stand all over the world, and their design is almost always repeated. Let's take these winged creatures. They are on the triumphal arches of Africa, Italy, France, and even India. In other words, in the photo, we see a classic triumphal arch. Now let's try to read the text written on the plate. And we see that someone destroyed the text. That is, it is unclear who and why built this structure. Now we go back to the 20th century and read what specially trained people wrote. It turns out that, in 1912th year, on the centenary of the Battle of Borodino, the Triumphal Gate was renovated and cleaned, and they cleaned it so well that they even destroyed the remnants of the text that was seen back in 1883. Take a look at this blank plaque in a photograph from 1931. That is, we know about the history of this structure only from the fables of specially trained people. No style, no figure. There are not even surviving inscriptions confirming that this is an arch. Monument to the War of 1812. Now let's look at another interesting memorial located on the territory of Germany. It is called the Hall of Liberation. It is dedicated to the memory of fallen heroes in the Liberation War. In the Liberation anti-Napoleonic Wars of 1813–14 years. The memorial was allegedly built in 1863 year, that is, 50 years after the war. It was built according to the project of architect Leo von Klentz. This is just an amazing German architect. You don't even suspect what contribution he made to the architecture of Russia. But more on that later. Let's take a look at this structure first. The cylinder is 60 meters high, covered with a dome, and decorated with huge statues of 18 tribes, the progenitors of the German nation. A very grandiose structure, and it is dedicated to the events of 1813th year. Or rather, specially trained people say that it is dedicated to the events of 1813th year. The inscriptions inside and outside of this complex do not confirm this fact. There is an inscription on the marble floor that reads like this: "Never forget what made the liberation struggle necessary, and how it was a victory." There is another inscription above the entrance portal. The official translation sounds like this: German liberator Ludwig, the first king of Bavaria. Google translates this phrase a little differently. German liberation fighter Ludwig, the first king of Bavaria. I do not know which translation to trust more. Let the German comrades correct me. But, in any version of the translation, nothing is said about the War of 1813. In other words, a huge memorial has been built in a beautiful place. But in honor of what it is built, it is simply impossible to determine from the inscriptions. But for some reason, in the works of specially trained people, this memorial is attributed to the events of 1813th year. Let's go further and look for other massive monuments dedicated to the events of 1812. I will show the Tower of Strangers a little later, but for now, we will focus on the largest project of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow. This temple, according to the version of you-know-who, is dedicated to the patriotic war of 1812. Everything seems to be in order here. A lot of disappeared sources confirm this. Only one moment is annoying. The temple was built only 70 years after the end of the war. And if you look at the photos of the beginning of the 20th century, which I showed in my videos, we will see that the exterior decoration of the temple was not finished back in 1907 year. In other words, the temple actually opened only 100 years after the war. It's all kind of weird. The main monuments are completed 100 years after the event to which these monuments were dedicated. That is, for some unknown reason, at the beginning of the 20th century, they began to actively promote the story of the War of 1812. Nameless triumphal arches began to hang signs with the necessary text. Nameless German complex to invent a new story, linking them with the events of 1813th year. In addition, it is in the 1913th year that new monuments dedicated to the events of 1812-13th years are solemnly opened. Interestingly, the type and interpretation of the inscriptions on these monuments is also very ambiguous. Let's take for a start a monument erected in Smolensk on September 10, 1913. Everything seems to be fine with this monument. It is signed only in old photos, a little strange monument to the heroes of the 12th year, grateful Russia. To the heroes of the 12th year. It's kind of weird. It seems to be the official text, but why only the 12th year? Well, okay, let's not quibble, but let's look at other interesting points. That's what the official description sounds like. The monument is a large rock, on top of which two large eagles protect the nest, to which Gal climbs up the rock in armor, and with a sword in his hand. Everything seems to be in order here. The composition displays an enemy who is trying to get to the nest. That is, Smolensk. The nest is protected by two eagles of the army of Bagration and Barclay de Tolly. At first glance, a very patriotic plot. On the other hand, there is an ancient Gali legend that says a young warrior, in order to prove himself, must climb a rock and steal an eagle's egg from the nest. In other words, we see a monument dedicated to the valor of a young fearless Gaul. The Soviet authorities reacted ambiguously to this monument, for some reason unknown to us, in 1917th year. A bronze map of Russia with the inscription Grateful Russia to the heroes of 1812th year was dismantled. The map was removed, but for some reason, it was left until the corner eagle. The eagle was dismantled much later. I wonder what the Bolsheviks didn't like about this map. It would look more logical if they removed the double-headed eagle. But in 1917, the eagle is in place, but there is no map. One can of course assume that it's all about the bronze. There were not enough non-ferrous metals in the country, so the card was sent for melting. That's how it is. Only the wreaths surrounding the eagles are also bronze. And for some reason, they were not sent to be melted down. The map was returned to the monument only in 1950s. Photos can be viewed on the old Smolensk forum. So, in 1913th year, a monument was opened that carries a very twofold meaning. Either the enemy is ruining the nest, or the valiant Gal shows his parole. Let's go further and look at another very ambiguous monument. On the 17th of August 1817, in honor of the victory of Russia in the Patriotic War of 1812, cast iron gates with a very remarkable inscription were installed in Tsarskoye Selo. To my dear colleagues, at first glance, there is nothing seditious about these gates. The material is cast iron. The inscription is very friendly. True, it is of course difficult to correlate it with the events of 1812th year. Well, since specially trained people say that this is a monument to the War of 1812, let's believe them. Now let's exhale and see what is written on the front part of the gate. As you know, fences even today put the beautiful side out. So the inscription kindly looks at my colleagues in our yard. In other words, this is not our front part. From the front part, everything is different. That is, the words are the same, but written in French. In other words, the author addresses his beloved colleagues in the language of the aggressor. I don't even know what to compare it with. This is the same as signing a World War II monument with German letters on the front side. In other words, Russia won in 1812, but on the front part of the gate, it is written in French, by my beloved colleague. So who won this war? Okay, let's leave our beloved colleagues aside for now and look at the work of the brilliant German architect Leo von Klintz. This man is credited with creating the most mystical structures in Germany. Valhalla, Regensburg. Here is an unrealized project in the same Regensburg. It seems to be Germany, but it looks somehow Oriental. Glyptothek. The Hall of Liberation, which I have already told you about. About the Saw Munich. That is, this architect lived in the early 19th century, but almost everything he designed looks like ancient antiquity. In addition, the client has not forgotten about Russia. It was according to his project that the building of the new Hermitage and the portico with Atlantans were built. But in principle, this information cannot surprise people interested in architecture. It can't, but this project, I think, will surprise someone. Here's a look at this masterpiece. What do you think it is? I won't torment you for a long time. This is according to Leo von Klentz's version of the Russian church. Strange, isn't it? Klenze has been to St. Petersburg and should know what the Russian church looks like. Or is it again memories from the future, when they have not yet decided what the original Russian style should look like? Russian church concept was proposed by Leo von Klenze, which was never approved by the Council for the Creation of Russian Culture. But this is all my speculation except for this Russian church. Okay, let's leave the sketches from the future alone and take a better look at the alien base, or rather, a monument to the Battle of the Nations. It was installed in Leipzig in 1913th year, dedicated to the Battle of Leipzig 1813th year. In short, at Leipzig, the armies of Russia, Prussia, Austria and Sweden defeated the army of Napoleon. And so, in honor of this great victory, they built a monument 91 meters high, and for some reason, called the Monument to the Battle of the Nations. A strange name for a German monument, because, according to the assurances of specially trained people, the Germans fought on both sides in this battle. That is, the Germans who were in coalition with Russia killed Germans who served in Napoleon's army. In short, in this battle, the German nation self-destructed itself. And after that, the Germans themselves built a monument to the Battle of the Nations. I wonder which nations they had in mind. Now let's see how this monument is decorated. This is the Archangel Michael. The head of Barbarossa is the guardian statue on the dome. Sculpture depicting the people's power. Sculpture the power of faith. It was as if an ordinary person trusted a giant. And this is the dome of the memorial, and it is decorated with such riders. The quality of the photos is not very good, but it looks like wings behind the riders. And this is the general view. If you don't know where it is, one might think that this is the lost city of Cambodia. And here is the most mystical photo. A crypt with a warrior. I do not know what associations this room evokes in you, but it's like I'm looking at footage from a fantastic movie. Some kind of hall with aliens, and most importantly, everything looks very modern, like a modern Hollywood set. But all this was invented and built in 1913. And the most important building is about the war with Napoleon, but in fact, a mystical structure that evokes thoughts of eternity and other worlds. It's all strange, but it was in 1912 that the history of wars began to be unwound anew. 1812. New monuments were erected, old ones were reassigned, and small details were invented. It was as if something global and terrible was hidden under all this paper tinsel. That's it. Watch my channel.